They see Ukraine as losers. They see it as a drain on American national resources. I think there's a sense that they just see it as a sort of, a TV show that's jumped the shark and is no longer very interesting. It isn't changing enough anymore. It's not very exciting. It's clear there are people around Trump who see rebuilding bridges with Russia as a huge economic bonanza, much more exciting than rebuilding a devastated Ukraine.
You mentioned earlier that President Zelensky, had been briefed not to lose his temper, to try and have a more emollient tone. Do you think he got that wrong? Or, as you say, is it important for him in front of the world's media not to accept things that aren't true? Because that would then form the basis of any further negotiation. If you accept that your country has been a warmonger or accept that your country hasn't been keen on peace, have you just made that a part of official history because all the cameras have watched you not disagree to it? It's a really difficult position. What do you think he should have done?
It is enormously complicated. Zelensky's, we've all seen, he's a sensationally gifted communicator. He, like Trump, is an entertainer or a TV personality or has been at some point. He's tremendously adept at subtle communication. And I think on a different day, I'm sure the Zelensky that we've seen charming the world could have found a way to handle that situation more diplomatically. That's not to say that he did the wrong thing, but I think it's easy to understand if you've come from a country that's been on the receiving end of what Ukraine's been on the receiving end for the last 3 years, and then you turn up in that atmosphere. It's easy to understand why he slightly snapped, but I do think he could have found. I'm sure he left afterwards thinking, I wish that I'd handled that slightly differently. That said, he went on Fox News later that evening and he said, I'm not sure that we did anything wrong. He sounded genuinely bewildered that, he hadn't accused Trump and Vance of selling Ukraine down the river. He hadn't accused them of being in cahoots with Vladimir Putin. He could have done, but he didn't. He was, to my ears, restrained and moderate. It's really amazing how strong the kind of animus against Ukraine is amongst a lot of the people around President Trump. A lot of the people in his circle are just fed up with Ukraine. They see it, they see Ukraine as losers. They see it as a drain on American national resources. I think there's a sense that they just see it as a sort of, a TV show that's jumped the shark and is no longer very interesting. It isn't changing enough anymore. It's not very exciting. It's clear there are people around Trump who see rebuilding bridges with Russia as a huge economic bonanza, much more exciting than rebuilding a devastated Ukraine.
And, you mentioned before, J.D. Vance, for example, said a lot of this in the run-up to the election. We saw Ukraine almost become part of the culture war. They didn't see why they should be helping. They saw it as a complete drain on American resources. And it's part of that sort of Biden progressive coalition that they hate everything about it. That's J.D. Vance and Trump World's position on it. Just tell us about Trump himself, because he has history with Zelensky. As he pointed out, he did send weapons to help Ukraine in his first term, but they also had a bit of a falling out. Now, we did a whole podcast on this last week, so if you're listening and you want to hear more, do go back and have a listen. But just remind us briefly of some of the animosity there.
One of the things that this press conference reminded us was that Trump and Zelensky, they have bad blood that dates back to 2019 when Trump was hit. The first impeachment against Donald Trump was to do with Ukraine. It was there was allegations that Trump had tried to essentially pressure Zelensky, who was then newly installed as president of Ukraine, into investigating Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, over the activities of the company that Hunter Biden worked with in Ukraine, because Joe Biden was going to be running against Trump in the 2020 election. And that, even though Zelensky said that he hadn't felt pressured by Trump, I think that's correct. That Trump there's a sense that Trump blamed Zelensky over that 2019 impeachment inquiry. The other thing that came out of Friday very loud and clear towards the end was when Trump was talking about Putin. And it reminded us that in Trump's first term, he might have fallen out with Zelensky, but he formed clearly a real bond with Putin. I don't think I've ever heard him explain it as clearly as he did on Friday, but he talked about how when Zelensky was saying that Putin essentially is not a man of his word, he's someone who breaks diplomatic agreements, ceasefire agreements, Trump responded that, well, he did that because it was Biden or because it was Obama that was in power at the time. He wouldn't do that with me. And when he was asked why, he said, because we trust each other, essentially. And asked why, he said it's because we went through the whole Russia, as he called it, the Russia, the Russia hoax. He meant that, the huge apparatus of the federal investigation into whether Russia had meddled in the 2016 US election that brought Donald Trump to power for the first time. Trump's version of those events was that he went through the fire with Vladimir Putin over as essentially the victims of the US intelligence agencies investigating them, which I thought was completely extraordinary, really, to hear him say it like that. But it reminded us that he has a bond with Putin, and he doesn't have that bond with Zelensky.
That's The Story from The Times and The Sunday Times. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Manveen Rana from The Story, a daily news podcast from The Times. Join me and my co-host Luke Jones for a deep dive into the big stories and investigations. Plus, each month, William Hague hosts an agenda-setting interview with a key newsmaker or big thinker. That's The Story, The Times daily podcast that brings you one remarkable story told in depth. Listen every weekday on The Times radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.